In the mid-1700s, Laura Bassi was one of the most famous and highest paid scientists of all of Italy. Other scientists around Europe wrote to her for advice, dedicated their work to her, and traveled to Bologna just to see her. Although most of her publications have been lost to time and sexism, we know that she encouraged the study of Newtonian physics and Franklin's view of electricity throughout Italy and Europe, and her influence was enormous. For example, her cousin Lazzaro Bolognesi credited her with the fact that he became a pioneering biologist. And you can see her impact on the development of the battery through her student Luigi Galvani and her admirer Alessandro Volta. But who was Laura Bassi? How did she become so famous? And why isn't she famous now? Ready for her story? Let's go.
Electricity, 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 electricity.
Laura Bassi's rise to fame arguably started in 1732 when the leaders of the town of Bologna gathered to discuss a terrible problem. The University of Bologna, the oldest university in Europe, was in severe decline. Plague had decimated the town and the silk industry had moved elsewhere. Also, as the church was in complete control of what university students could study and say, the university was less popular with foreign visitors, especially ones that believed the earth goes around the sun. What made this meeting so influential is that the leaders of the town, the university, and the local archbishop had a radical idea: award a doctorate to 20-year-old Laura Bassi. Bassi was known by her family as a genius from an early age. She was the only child of a local lawyer named Giuseppe Bassi and his wife, Rosa Cesari. When she was just 5, her cousin was so impressed with her intelligence, he decided to personally tutor her in mathematics and in Latin. Then, when she was a teenager, her doctor was also inspired to be her tutor and taught her more science and more languages. In fact, she was so skilled at languages that a local poet said that her Latin was better than his native language. Early in 1732, Laura's family and tutors decided that Laura should put on a demonstration to a select group of elite Bolognese gentlemen, including the new Archbishop Prospero Lambertini. It was these performances that led to the radical idea of allowing Laura to earn her doctorate. Now, Laura Bassi wasn't the first woman to earn a doctorate from a university. She was the second. Over 50 years earlier, a woman named Priscopia received a degree in philosophy from the University of Padua, and over 20,000 people came to see the spectacle. Come see the thinking woman! So the university and the city had a pretty good inkling of what this would do for their town. By April 17th, 1732, Laura Bassi earned her degree by writing a series of papers on philosophy and physics and defending them publicly. Her defense was made into a spectacle of epic proportion, where even her dress was preordained. She was given a silver crown, a ring, an ermine mantle, and people wrote her endless poems and accolades. They even printed a special medal in her honor. A local poet wrote his friend that, quote, all the gentlemen of Bologna make a great display of this girl and depict her everywhere as a miracle of our age. In October, she had a second round of defenses, which she passed easily, and then was awarded a lectureship at the university with a 500 lira a year paycheck. She was ecstatic and wrote a friend, "The Senate raised me beyond what I asked for and dreamed of to the highest dignity of speaking in public." But she spoke too soon, because then the Senate decided that they didn't want to burden her with too much teaching, declaring that Bassi, quote, should not read in public schools, i.e. teach, except on those occasions when her superiors commanded her because of her sex. Despite not teaching often, one of the advantages of Laura's new position is in what she could read. See, the Vatican had decided that the works of Galileo, Descartes, Kepler, Copernicus, and more were too dangerous for public consumption. and were kept in a special library and only allowed to be read by doctors of philosophy who were at least 24 years old. In 1735, the second she turned 24, Laura Bassi became the only woman in all of the papal state that was legally allowed to read these books. Still, most of the men in power would have preferred if she kept herself to the feminine art of poetry and then be trotted out every once in a while like a circus freak. Laura wasn't interested. By February 1737, she was writing a friend that she had no desire to compose poetry ever again. Laura continued to push to try to be able to teach, either at the university or at home. However, the university continued to deny her ability to teach at the university, and it was considered scandalous for a single woman to have men enter her home. What to do? In 1737, Laura decided that what she needed to do was get married. She chose a fellow professor named Giuseppe Verratti. Unfortunately, I cannot find a single image of Verratti, so I've decided that he looks just like Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Because, well, why not? Anyway, Verratti was a 30-year-old science and biology professor at the University of Bologna. Laura wrote a friend, quote, "My domestic circumstances have induced me to change my mind and make this decision. I'd hoped to quietly pursue science studies in this life. Therefore, I have chosen a person who walks my path in the arts, and who, through long experience, I was certain would not impede me from following mine." Despite her protestations that she would continue to teach and study after marriage, and in fact she was only getting married to help her continue to teach and study, the town hated the idea that she was going to get married and thought that it was defying her extraordinary feminine ability to lack virginity. In fact, a local historian who was a supporter of women in science wrote an op-ed that "you have changed the virginal decency into conjugal bonding," and he cried, "You have stained your glory." Laura Bassi married Giuseppe Verratti in February of 1737, and she was right. It allowed her to go to more university classes, protected by her status, and it allowed her to start a research and teaching institute in her home. Laura was also correct in her assessment of her husband, as he supported his wife as a scientist. Laura Bassi then diligently wrote, taught, conducted original experiments, and even wrote dreaded poetry, while she gave birth to at least 8 children and raised 5 children who lived past infancy. In addition, the Bassi-Verratti home was considered a must-stop for any visiting scholar. And according to the scientist Fontana, their home was, quote, "the most open and welcoming in Bologna." In 1740, Laura's prospects improved even more, because that's when her benefactor, the Cardinal Lambertini, was elected Pope. In 1745, the new Pope, now called Benedict XIV, became interested in promoting science at the University of Bologna. So he created a new group of scientists called the Benedettina, who got more money and prestige, but were required to publish 1 original work a year and attend 3/4 of all meetings. Laura was distressed to find that the original group of Benedettitas included her husband, but not her. Wisely, she asked the Pope if he could up the number of Benedettitas from 24 to 25 to include her, and he agreed. The authorities tried to fight Bassi on this appointment, but with the Pope on her side, she prevailed and presented original research for the next 31 years until her death. In 1747, Laura's husband was asked to study the medical uses of electricity. So to conduct experiments, they became the first private people in Bologna to own an electricity machine. This was such a coup that when Laura's husband was on vacation, he wrote his bride to remember the electrical machine, the love I feel for my children, and to yourself, who are the greatest wealth I possess on this earth. Ah, scientific love. In 1752, Bassi and Verratti heard about the electrical experiment in France, getting sparks from a kinked metal pole in a thunderstorm. This was done to validate Benjamin Franklin's theory that lightning was electric. And Bassi and Verratti became the first people in Bologna to reproduce this experiment. However, when they tried to install lightning rods, there were mass protests and they quickly took them down. 18 years later, Laura was still complaining that despite their best efforts, they couldn't install lightning rods in Bologna. Meanwhile, to circumvent the restrictions against teaching at the university that were still in place, Laura started teaching more at home. One of her first students was her younger cousin, Lazzaro Balinazzi, who went to school to be a lawyer, but was convinced to switch to science by law. Balinazzi ended up being a revolutionary biologist. He became the first person to do in vitro fertilization on a frog, the first to do artificial insemination on a dog, the first to say that bats don't use their eyes to see, and to determine that digestion was a chemical process. He's possibly most famous for being the first to discover that microbes don't just spontaneously exist, but actually fly through the air and can be destroyed by boiling. And he did this almost 100 years before Louis Pasteur. When Laura Bassi died, Balinazzi wrote, "My venerable teacher, of whom I will always remember as long as I have spirit and life, I can truthfully say that what little I know originated from her intelligent teachings." Laura's classes started to gain popularity. She wrote a friend, "The classes have gathered such momentum that they are now attended by people of considerable education, including foreigners, rather than by youths." In a way, being restrained from teaching at university freed Laura to teach radical new ideas like Newton's philosophies and Benjamin Franklin's electrical theories, and also to do a lot of experiments which were sorely lacking in the traditional classroom. Still, her experiments were expensive. She wrote a friend that unless she received some form of financial assistance, she couldn't conduct them well, crying, "I'm almost in despair." Luckily, her classes were so popular and her demands for money so frequent and supported by powerful people like the Pope that by 1759, the Senate gave Laura a significant salary increase to cover the equipment, and she earned 1,200 lira a year, as much as the head of the science department. Eventually, Laura Bassi would receive the highest salary at the University of Bologna. In 1760 or so, independent of her husband, Laura began researching the physics of Benjamin Franklin's electrical theories. At the time, there was a real debate between the ideas out of France that there are two kinds of electricity that come from rubbing different kinds of objects, and Franklin's view that everything contained positive and negative charges, and that rubbing objects just moves some of the charges, leaving the object with a net positive or a net negative charge. One of the big arguments about Ben Franklin's idea of negative and positive electrical fluids was that how do negative objects repel each other? If they're both lacking in electrical fire, how do they promote a positive force against each other? It seemed like a real weakness of his theory. Laura Bassi came up with an idea of how this could work, but tragically, these ideas were lost. So I have no idea how valid they are, nor how clever. But I do have a letter from a fellow scientist in 1775 that says, quote, "You've expressed in most ingenious and subtle terms of physics a defense of the Franklinian system." Take that as you will, but she definitely influenced her fellow scientists, especially in Italy, to believe in Ben Franklin's view of electricity. Then in 1774, in order to help her study electricity, she set up outdoor electrical experimental station, and it was so popular that she had to change the venue to deal with the crowds. Now I want to talk about Alessandro Volta, Luigi Galvani, and Luigi's wife, Lucia Galvani, who were so important in the development of the battery. Alessandro Volta was born in Como, Italy, which is about 150 miles north of Bologna, in 1745. He was interested in electricity from an early age and a believer in Ben Franklin's view of electricity. In 1771, despite not knowing Laura at all, Volta dedicated his thesis to her, as his advisor told him that Laura Bassi, quote, "especially enjoys the delights of electricity." In the next few years, Volta's reputation increased for the development and promotion of an electrical machine in 1775 for his discovery of a flammable swamp gas, later called methane, in 1777. Despite this, Volta continued to be deferential and honorific to Laura Bassi. For example, in 1777, Volta asked for Laura's advice on swamp gases and her permission to name his newest instrument after Laura, as she was, quote, the beautiful ornament of natural sciences and the light and glory of your sex in our Italy. Luigi Galvani had an even closer connection to Laura Bassi, as he actually knew her personally, as he was from Bologna and was one of Laura Bassi's students in the late 1750s, while he got a degree in biology. Lucia Galeazzi was also from Bologna and knew Laura personally. In fact, Lucia was the daughter of the head of the science department at the University of Bologna. Lucia was also known to be incredibly skilled at languages and biology, and with tutoring from her father, Lucia became an assistant to her father and a medical doctor. I can find no documents that say that Lucia studied under Laura Bassi, but it defies logic that she didn't at least attend Laura's public talks, and possibly went to some classes as well. However, as Lucia was the daughter of a famous scientist instead of the daughter of a doctor, and that Bologna already had a female scientist, there was no talk of giving Lucia any degree. In 1762, Lucia married Luigi Galvani, and they both became her father's assistants. In 1770, Lucia Galvani's father became ill, and he retired as the head of the science department, and Luigi Galvani became a full professor and also became one of the Benedettinas, and she remained as now her husband assistant and editor. Meanwhile, they nominated a new man to be the head of the science department, and Verratti, Laura Bassi's husband, became his assistant. We will get back to the Galvanis and Volta in a little bit. 2 years after becoming the head of the science department, the new science director became ill and suddenly died. The position seems a little cursed. There's talk of replacing him with Giuseppe Verratti, which seemed logical, as Verratti had been his assistant. However, the authorities didn't think that Verratti had the mathematical skills nor the public reputation. However, there was someone in Italy who had excellent math skills and was possibly the most famous scientist in all of Italy, Laura Bassi. So in May of 1776, Laura Bassi, at the age of 65, became the first woman to have a professorship and the first female university chair, with her husband as her new assistant, thus making Laura Bassi not only the first female professor in the history of the modern world, but also her husband, the first person to lose out on a promotion to one's own spouse. However, as far as I can tell, Verratti was not mad, but instead proud of his wife and supportive of her. Finally, Laura could teach at the university. Then tragedy struck. Less than 2 years after she gained her position, she had a heart attack and died. The entire city mourned. Her body was buried in the Church of Corpus Domini with full honor, the first scientist buried there. In a few years, people started to ignore Laura Bassi and her contributions, and currently her gravestone is overlooked to view the graves of Lucia and Luigi Galvani, who were buried at the same church. It is only recently that people have slowly started to talk about her again, and most of the time they ignore her influence on the development of the battery. See, only a few years after Laura's untimely death, Luigi and Lucia Galvani decided to get their own electricity machine and accidentally discovered that electricity will animate dead animals as well as live ones. The Galvanis then made a system to study a dead frog with atmospheric electricity based on Laura Bassi's setup, and discovered that 2 different metals could also animate dead animals without needing an electricity machine or an electrical storm. In the middle of their intensive electrical experiments, Lucia Galvani died of complications from asthma, and Luigi Galvani took some time to grieve. By 1791, Luigi Galvani published his results and, pardon my pun, electrified the public with his ideas of animal electricity. The next year, Alessandro Volta started publishing his theory that the electrified frog had nothing to do with the life force of the frog. For the following 8 years, there was a fierce debate between Galvani's theories of electrical life and Alessandro Volta's theory of the electricity of metals. Giovanni Verratti was a supporter of the Galvanist camp, but his support seemed to have little influence on the general public. Although Galvani publicly thanked him, it's hard to know if Laura Bassi had lived, if she would have supported her student Galvani or her admirer and supporter Volta, or if she would have managed some compromise between the two. However, if she had lived, it's hard not to think that her thumb on the scale of public opinion would have been enormous, and many more people would know about her existence today. For in order to prove Galvani wrong, in 1800, Volta created a pile of stacked metals and salt water that produced continuous current. This object was quickly called a battery. So when you think about bats, or digestive systems, or defibrillators, or the battery, or anything electric, take a moment to think of the far-ranging influence of a brilliant woman of Bologna who succeeded despite all the odds, and her quiet husband who supported her along the way. Thanks for watching. If you're interested, I have a video about Galvani, I have a video about Volta, I have a video about Galvani's nephew, who was sort of a real-life Dr. Frankenstein. I have videos, I think 3, about Benjamin Franklin. I have a lot of videos. And despite the fact that I'm homeschooling 2 small children, I'm continuing to make videos. So please give this mom a thumbs up, share it on social media, put a comment there. Big thank you to my patrons. Stay safe out there, okay? Bye.